It's not huge, but it's large. Thank you for starting the recording. So our staff is sort of medium-sized, around 10 people, and but with a lot of others that work with us in smaller capacities. We have a large board, and between the staff and the board, we have quite a diverse religious, ethnic, and racial makeup. Our goal is to create communities of hope and reconciliation throughout our region. Our Religious Leaders Council has over 33 traditions that are represented, and the senior leaders of those organizations cover different kinds of territories. So we expand as we can into their places of influence. So we bring together religious leaders and congregants, and we have a signature youth program called Walking the Walk. And in each case, people from different backgrounds get to know each other and learn to value both their own traditions as they connect with people from others. So we've led a lot of programs in helping people cross religious boundaries and come to greater understanding of people who are different from themselves. And we've taken those skills that have been developed in leading those programs and trained hundreds of people to facilitate difficult conversations across other lines of difference. Now, the programs that I coordinate under the Art of Interfaith Understanding umbrella bring people to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, or like today, to a Zoom gathering. And we use the resources that are available in the visual arts to promote interfaith understanding. And some of the programs are contemplative, which invite people from whatever tradition they're from to go deeper into their own spirituality by engaging with art and with one another. And many of the programs are programs that help us understand the similarities and differences among religious traditions. And that's the kind of program that I'll be leading with you today. So some of the other titles that I've used besides what I'm doing today are Celebrations of Light, Connections, Passover and Holy Week, Nature's Revelations in Art from the World's Religions, Religious Pluralism in the United States, Art Informing Understanding, and there are several more. If you want more information, you can get in touch with me through Interfaith Philadelphia. You can just Google us and you'll find a way to reach me. So today I've chosen to focus on art and prayer in world religions. And I'm going to introduce three subtopics, as you see on your screen: art making as prayer, art as mediator in prayer, and art that models prayer. I'm going to offer just a few examples to show that there are similarities and differences among the world's religions when it comes to art and prayer. And I would encourage you to make a note if a question comes up or a comment you'd like to make. And then after each of these subtitles, we'll stop for a time of discussion. And I would encourage you to bring up examples that you might have used if you were doing the presentation, or questions that you have, or comments that you'd like to make. So we'll take some time for discussion after each of the three subtitles. So we're going to take just a few moments, half a minute really, to be silent, to take a few breaths, to leave behind the concerns and worries that we have with our day that have come with us, and begin to focus ourselves on art and prayer. So in 30 seconds, I'll bring us back to some content. Welcome back. Let's look at an overview of art making as prayer. And the first example that we're going to look at will be presented as a YouTube video of Tibetan Buddhists who are creating a sand mandala. And the narration of this YouTube presentation helps us understand how this form of art making is a form of prayer, and how what they go through blesses the process of making this work of art. So Kat, if you can start us off with that video.
Let me know if you have any difficulty with the sound again.
Tibetan medicine and healing has always been crucial to the Buddhist path. So creating a medicine mandala is one way of healing the community, but also healing the environment. The word mandala is actually a Sanskrit term, meaning container of essence. It is that sacred circle embodying some sacred essence within. Originally, they would have used powdered stones, powdered gems, things like lapis, malachite, and so on. Today, they use crushed marble made into sand. Now, the colors are very important because they symbolize different attributes of the deities. But in this particular one that we have here, it is all about the medicine Buddha and healing. And what they create is a heavenly palace all around him. Most of the monks had been in monasteries since the age of about 7. They would have learnt the actual art of painting a mandala in the first instance, but to actually make sand mandala takes about 5 years to train, because it's a very precise art, tapping the sand out of these copper funnels into these intricate geometric designs. The prayers that the monks perform are to do with invoking the presence of the medicine Buddha and inviting the healing power to enter the center of the mandala. And then throughout, when they're actually performing, creating the mandala, they are meditating on that same thought. And for those people who are watching, every grain of sand will give one a blessing. This form of Buddhism is about developing your mind's potential, or a way of transforming the mind. So the person who is using this in meditation would imagine themselves as the medicine Buddha in the center, and they would try and break down the barriers of their normal deluded life into the pure enlightened mind of the Buddha. A very important Buddhist belief is the impermanence. They don't believe that death is the end. It's just a passing phase. It's our essence that carries on, but also that you shouldn't be attached to anything. So the idea of the destruction of the sand mandala is really putting it to bed, if you like. We return to the elements, so too is the sand mandala return to the elements.
So the Buddhists in our video do not emphasize their own creativity. Instead, they carefully recreate traditional patterns, and they accompany the art making with traditional prayers. Let's go to the next slide. Another example of Buddhist art making is as prayer is the creation of calligraphy. That's created as a form of meditation. Though the practice goes back many centuries, the example I've chosen to share was created in 1959 by the Japanese artist Shiko Munakata. The 6 characters translate, as you see on the screen, they translate to say, "No footprints show where flowers are deep." It was created while Shiko was in a deep meditative state, And once in the proper mindset, the calligraphy was executed quickly with a burst of concentrated energy. Prayerful writing is something that's done in many traditions. It's also practiced in transcribing Hindu sacred texts, as well as when it's done by hand to create sacred texts from Christianity and Judaism and Islam. The Jewish artists who create Torah scrolls are known as sofrim. Next slide. A Torah scroll contains the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, traditionally understood as dictated by God to Moses. A portion of the scroll is read at every Sabbath service, and the entire scroll is read over the course of a year. The very helpful website My Jewish Learning tells us, quote, writing a Torah scroll is a religious act. First and foremost, a kosher Torah scroll must be handwritten. This is done by a sofer, a specially trained individual who is devout and knowledgeable in the laws governing the proper writing and assembling of a scroll. It takes about 3 years to write a whole Torah. Next slide. So I'm wondering, Rob, would you be willing to read this?
Sure. The story of a Torah scroll. The first thing I do is wash my hands. It is a Jewish custom to wash hands before every holy act. We don't wash our hands just to make them clean. We wash our hands to prepare our mind and heart to do something holy. Before he writes even a single word, the sofer must say a bracha, a blessing. When I write, I do what every sofer does. I sing every word and every letter out loud. Writing God's name is the most important part of writing a Torah. When a sofer writes God's name, there are lots of special preparations. On a day when I am going to write God's name, I go to the mikveh. A mikveh is a special pool of natural running water that a Jew uses to make himself or herself pure. For Jews, going to the mikveh helps us direct our hearts and our minds. It is like washing your hands and saying a bracha. To write God's name, I use a special quill that has never been used to write any other words. To write God's name, I use a special bottle of ink, which is used only to write God's name. No pens except my Hashem quills have ever touched it. Let me tell you one trick that I do that lots of sofrim do. When it is difficult to get to the mikveh every day, I save up all the times I have to write God's name. I write everything else on a page, but not God's name. Then once or twice a week, I go to the mikveh, take out my special tools, and spend the day writing God's name. It is easier to work that way. And it is easier to really direct my heart towards each writing of God's name.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
The prayerful preparations of the sofer and the sofer's sense of the inherent holiness of each letter in the Torah makes creating a Torah a way to pray. Next slide. Other genres of Jewish art are less reliant on traditional forms and more open to innovation. Hider mitzvah literally means the beautification of a mitzvah. A hider mitzvah is an action that glorifies or beautifies the observances and celebrations within Jewish tradition. It's an action that's carried out with intentionality and purposefulness and thoughtfulness. Glorifying a mitzvah is a demonstration of one's commitment to God. So this slide shows 2 works of art, a beautifully made menorah and a gorgeous Torah crown that tops the cloth container in which the Torah scroll is stored. So when making such objects, artists are not limited by traditional forms. You can see that especially when in the example that I've chosen of a menorah. Creating beautiful ritual art is a mitzvah, an action pleasing to God. And in my mind, at least, actions pleasing to God are a kind of prayer. So I've included making beautiful ritual objects in this section on art making as prayer. Next, we'll go back to calligraphy, this time in Islam. Just as traditional Judaism sees the Torah as the word of God dictated to Moses, so Islam understands the words of the Quran to be the words of Allah. The exact Arabic words spoken by Allah to the angel Gabriel were repeated by Gabriel, word for word, in Arabic, to the Prophet Muhammad. In turn, the Prophet repeated them to scribes who wrote down the Quran in Arabic using calligraphy. In a handwritten Quran, each stroke of the pen is considered an act of prayer, a way to be in the presence of the divine speaker. So the word that has been spoken is contained in the word that is being written on the page. Now, there are some differences between Judaism and Islam when it comes to transcribing or writing sacred texts. Torah scrolls only use a couple types of script, only a couple variations of styles of calligraphy. But there are many different Qurans. There are many different styles of calligraphy used in the handwriting of Qurans. Another difference between Torah scrolls and Qurans is that Torah scrolls have only words and no decorations or illustrations. Qurans, on the other hand, have decorative elements added to the sacred text, and you can see those in this illustration. Some of these markings mark the beginning of a new chapter, and then there are other markings that designate particular readings. So these designations or designs are offerings of praise to Allah, praising Allah by surrounding Allah's words with beauty. The writing and decoration of Qurans are examples of art making as prayer. Every stroke of the pen is an act of prayer, an act which unites the writer with Allah and praises Allah. Now, Christian illuminated manuscripts combine illustrations and decorative elements with the text. And go to the next slide. In general, Christianity is the least strict of the three Abrahamic religions about creating images of the divine. So symbols and images of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit can be found in Christian Bibles. Just 20 years ago, St. John's Abbey and University in Collegeville, Minnesota, commissioned the St. John's Bible. This is the first handwritten and illuminated Bible commissioned by a Benedictine monastery in more than 500 years. Donald Jackson was chosen to be the calligrapher, and he coordinated the work of several artists to bring the St. John's Bible into being. When Jackson described the process that he used in approaching the calligraphy and writing down the text, he compared it to the monastic practice of Lectio Divina, a careful mulling over the text, looking at the details, thinking, meditating, letting it sink in, letting key parts of the text come forward into the consciousness. There was a committee on illumination and text for this Bible who wrote theological briefs, and they also likened their work to the experience of Lectio Divina in a group. So Donald Jackson and this whole committee, their sacred reading had a practical aim, which was to spark visual ideas, the calligraphic form and illustrations that are in and with the text. And this is just one page at the beginning of the Gospel according to John. It's a magnificent several-volume work of an illuminated manuscript by modern artists. Next slide. So Hindu is an umbrella term that was adopted by the British And they used that term of Hindu to refer to thousands of local religious traditions in South Asia. And if you listed all of the gods that were worshipped within those local traditions, the total would come to millions of different gods. But some of the gods are generally worshipped by many or most of those individual local traditions. And one of those that many of them have in common is the god Shiva. And this is a sculpture of Shiva. He is the destroyer and purifier. For example, he uses his long hair as a filter to purify polluted rivers. And his third eye, the one in the middle of his forehead, is called the eye of fire and refers to the eye of higher perception. It looks inward much of the time, but when it's directed outward, it burns all that appears before it, purifying and preparing the way for a new creation. Snakes are another attribute of Shiva. Here you can see the snake forms curling through the hair of the god. Snakes periodically shed their skin, which symbolizes the cycle of death and rebirth in all of nature. And in Hindu belief, there is a role for Shiva to play in this cycle of death and rebirth. Now, like the creators of sand mandalas and Torah scrolls and handwritten Qurans, Hindu artists look to ancient texts for directions dictating how to create murti, M-U-R-T-I. That's the name for images of divine beings. The texts prescribe the proper proportions, the positions, and the gestures for specific images. At each stage in the creation of a murti, the art making is understood to be prayer. Specific mantras are chanted to sanctify the process. The mantras and accompanying actions evoke and invoke the power of the deity in the image. In some Hindu traditions, a murti is dedicated by priests through a ritual in which mantras are recited, whereby the divine vital energy of the cosmos is infused into the sculpture. So a murti is itself not a god, but it is a shape, an embodiment, or a manifestation of a deity. So next slide, please. This is a prayer, an example of a prayer which recognizes the holiness of creating a Hindu murti. O tree, you have been selected for the worship of a deity. Salutations to you. I worship you per rules. Kindly accept my worship. May all who live in this tree find residence elsewhere. May they forgive us now. We bow to them. Next slide. This slide illustrates the belief that Jesus' apostle Luke was the first Christian icon writer. He is credited with creating many images of the Virgin Mary. The word icon comes from the Greek and means image. And icons are commonly found in the churches and homes of Greek, Russian, Armenian, Ukrainian, and other ethnic Orthodox Christian traditions. Some iconographers create images of contemporary figures. For example, Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa. But as we've seen in other faiths, traditional Orthodox iconographers copy ancient icons. And they recite the same prayers and use the same techniques and materials that have been used for millennia. One iconographer has written, "We pray during the process. We don't sign our work, but rather acknowledge the Holy Spirit as the source of an icon." So art making is affirmed in the following rules for the icon painter. And if we could have the next slide, we'll see those rules. And Deborah, would you be willing to read the rules for the icon painter?
Yes, sure. Rules
Thank
for
you.
the icon painter. Before starting work, make the sign of the cross. Pray in silence and pardon your enemies. Work with care on every detail of your icon, as if you were working in front of the Lord himself. During work, pray in order to strengthen yourself physically and spiritually. Avoid, above all, useless words and keep silence. Pray in particular to the saint whose face you are painting. Keep your mind from distractions and the saint will be close to you. When you have to choose a color, stretch out your hands interiorly to the Lord and ask his counsel. Do not be jealous of your neighbor's work. His success is your success too. When your icon is finished, thank God that his mercy granted you the grace to paint the holy images. Have your icon blessed by putting it on the altar. Be the first to pray before it, before giving it to others. Never forget the joy of spreading icons in the world, the joy of the work of icon painting, the joy of giving the saint the possibility to shine through his icon, the joy of being in union with the saint whose face you are painting.
Thank you. So for the iconographer and for the ones who pray with the icon after it is finished, the icon enables a profound sense of unity with the holy, with the saints, and with God. An icon is a window through which one sees heaven and those who dwell there. And at the same time, it is a window through which the glory of God shines on the beholder. Next slide. So this is our first break. And can we go back to gallery view, Pat? And either raise your hand, or maybe we're small enough, if you just have something to say, you can just speak up. Let's see how that works.
Oh, I need to say how much I'm blessed, because I've been getting your newsletters for so long and listening to what of these programs that you've been presenting. And I wished I was back in Philadelphia. And here's my opportunity to see it. Thank you.
I'd just like to say something. Bringing people together to talk and dialogue is one way, but I love the idea of using art as a way to gather people, because it is on this wonderful ground of peace. There's no quibbling about the art. I mean, it's just art, and it's beautiful, and it's a way to have people start to talk with one another that maybe they haven't talked to each other before. So looking at the art, discussing the art, it just sounds like it's bringing people together, which I love. Thank you.
Yeah, and it really does. And I think one of the reasons is exactly what you said, is that art has that kind of quality of bringing peace and openness to people. But it's also, in some ways, a kind of neutral ground, even if it's from a tradition.
Exactly.
And so people from the tradition that's being represented can give nuances of how they perceive that piece of art and its place in their tradition. And it feels like a safer place to start a conversation across divisions than some other contexts.
I think it moves you into the right part of your brain, into
Yes.
that creative expression, rather than the logic and do. It gives you that softer side of yourself, and you see the softer side of other people. I love that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I also want to say thank you. And I really agreed that art, and I feel that art and music as well is a universal language. It breaks barriers of not only cultural barriers but also language barriers. So some people may not be able to understand very well or communicate very well, because of language barriers. They can understand each other in art and music. So that reminds me of the 90s festival we used to have here for faith, arts, and justice. So it's through art and that and more through art and music that our faith really comes across, even if we have various of a lot of different kinds of various cultural backgrounds, language barriers. I also want to know, like, how do we follow, like, you have a newsletter, like, how do we get sign up on that, onto that?
So I think if you Google Interfaith Philadelphia, there were, and just follow the usual prompts that should be, and there's the website has just been put into the chat, so you can either get it from there or check it out later.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is very good. Thanks.
John, this is Ruth.
Yes, Ruth.
Yes, I want to thank you for dedicating your session to the arts, because I can't tell you how important that has been in all my 30 years of work. I've made it a sine qua non of every event that I've ever been involved in to have one aspect of the arts involved, and especially music, as Abigail was pointing out about how do we enter the heart and not the mind first to get people vibrating at the same frequency. And also, I had an opportunity to present a film at the Embassy of Bangladesh in Washington, D.C. many years ago. And the ambassador was very kind. He kind of gave me free rein to organize everything. And so the events had an art exhibit that was already in the embassy. And the first thing that people heard was the music of a tabla player from India and a Jewish clarinetist. And so even before any word was spoken, people already understood what interfaith harmony was. So the arts have that special ability. And someone once said to me, if the artists were in control of the world, we would have peace. and I think that there's something
most artists.
Right. But it's just that respect, that mutual respect that exists in the art world as well. Yes. So I just really appreciate your dedicating your session to this, and I hope that you will also present at the Parliament and at other similar events, so that more people can think about using the arts for their interfaith interconnectivity. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's why I created the musical, is because I wanted to get to mainstream people, not just to interfaith community. And yes. I thought the theater would be the best place to do that. So
yeah, and we've also found that our programs at the Art Museum do attract art lovers who may not be as religiously engaged as some others. And just remind you that there are a couple more portions. They're shorter than the first, but I'm not done presenting, but I'm glad to hear any other comments at this point. Jennifer.
I'm particularly interested in ways in which these similar but different art forms as prayer can be used together. And Ruth, I appreciated where you talked about two musicians playing different instruments, different types of music, perhaps together. Not that there's a blending, but a combining or a meeting of these two musics to provide something completely other. And that's what I'm interested in interfaith. When I listen to your presentation, I'm struck by some of the similarities that, yes, we use sacred writing in various traditions, but I want to see how that comes together, if it can come together. Is there a way that we're doing our sacred writing, or, not me, but some of these people who do the sacred writing from different traditions, is there an opportunity to practice at the same time in the same place the different traditions? Where are the intersections? Where is the opportunity for prayer that transcends? So I didn't attend the interfaith, there was something about sacred music, and the musicians from different traditions played. played, over the course of the time, and it was a contemplative engagement of what resonates with you in kind of a retreat format. But there was never a time where the musicians were playing together from different traditions. And I'm curious about the intersection.
It's a fascinating idea. It's certain. I mean, in my experiences with dialogue that then shares information together, or with people being invited into to participate in a religious tradition not their own. And we have, I think many communities do have like Thanksgiving worship or some other kinds of occasions when the community comes together to pray together. The Religious Leaders Council here in Philadelphia distinguishes between praying with and I can't remember now the name of the other thing, but praying with and praying together, or praying as one, or praying in the same context. And there's a place for both. But you've made me start to think about how that might happen with artists, and that's a very creative thought that you've planted in my brain. So I thank you for that.
By the way, I just want to comment that Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist, made an incredible film called The Silk Road, on the Silk Road, where he gathered musicians from all over the world and took them on a retreat and said to them, at the end of the retreat, we're going to play together. And I don't know how this is going to work, because some of the musical traditions were so vastly different that they didn't know if it could work. And then the culmination of the film is when they have this grand orchestra of people from the smallest villages in India playing with people from New York, and it's just phenomenal. So it is possible. And I encourage you, that is a film that could be shown to an interfaith community, and then talk about how you could do that yourselves.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go ahead into the next section. Actually, first I'm going to do a little postscript to what we did first as Artist Prayer, just to expand the vision a little bit as to what might be involved, not just outside of traditional religious communities. So, Kat, if we can go back to the PowerPoint. And yes, we'll start with Mark Rothko. Rothko was an abstract expressionist painter in the middle of the 20th century. He described his experience of painting as mystical. And he also expressed his hope that viewers of his paintings would have the same mystical experience that he had had while he was painting. He was born in Russia in a time of anti-Semitic pogroms. He was educated in an Orthodox Jewish school. He immigrated with his parents to America when he was still young. And his parents, even though they immigrated to America, were well, this was before Israel was founded, but they were ardent Zionists. So I think his mysticism, which he did not often talk about as Jewish mysticism, certainly has roots in that tradition. Next slide, please. My own experience of making art as a form of prayer has been guided by Sister Marianne Hyde. She coined the term art journaling. I choose colors and shapes and lines and shadows that I put on paper or canvas, and I do that to express what is going on in my own soul, my emotions, how I'm approaching a decision, how I'm understanding an important relationship, whatever is pressing for attention within. The process is a way to offer myself to God, using the language of art rather than the language of words. As I contemplate what I've created and discuss it with my spiritual director or a counselor or a trusted friend, new perspectives occur to me. Next slide. An example that turned out to be kind of dramatic for me and had an impact was art journaling, a piece that I did almost 25 years ago, but it's still relevant in my life. I created this work to express my frustration and my anger. I was working as a regional director for a Lutheran campus ministry at the time, and people were not listening very well to my ideas. My leadership was not being accepted. So I sat down with a large piece of paper and my oil pastels, and I made these angry lines and pushed the pigment into the paper, pressing very hard with my thumb and fingers. And as I was doing that, I felt a kinship with the psalm writer who shook his fist at the heavens and cried, "How long, O Lord, must I wait for your help?" It was a cathartic experience to do that with these oil pastels. Then I turned the painting around. Next slide. And what I saw was the Holy Family from my Christian heritage. Mary holding the Christ child, the angel, or maybe it's Joseph, leaning over her to kiss her forehead. I quickly decided that the small figure in the lower right corner was me, and the long arm of the baby Jesus was reaching out to pull me into the circle of love that is God's family. I've used this painting ever since as a reminder that it is more important to be in loving relationships with others in God's family, that is, other people of whatever tradition they're from. It's more important to be in loving relationships than it is to get them to agree with my ideas. It changed the way I look at leadership, and it changed the way I looked at ministry. And I must admit, though, that this is a lesson that I've had to learn over and over and over again, including this week, and in all of the years that since I prayed and painted this work of art. So now, after that little excursion, let's move to the next slide and our next section with his art as a mediator in prayer. This is shorter than the first section, but there are several images I'd like to share with you, because most, if not all religious traditions rely on art to bring the devotee into prayerful connection with the divine, or to bring them along the path to enlightenment. So next slide. Architectural features can mediate the attributes of the divine. The height of Gothic cathedrals places the worshiper in relationship to a reality larger than the self. Next. Sunlight streaming through stained glass windows creates an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere. Many stained glass windows in houses of worship illustrate stories or symbolize important beliefs. These mediate the tradition to those entering for prayer and suggest potential subjects for prayer. For example, these windows are part of a series called The Prophetic Quest. It's a set of 10 stained glass windows designed by Jacob Landau and installed in 1974 in Congregation Knesset Israel in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, which is where I live and which is just outside Philadelphia. Each of the 10 windows represents a prophet and the prophet's message. Some of the images, they're all very complex, as you see, but one of the images that is seen in the details somewhere is even a TV set. So there are some very contemporary things that are mixed in with the ancient prophetic messages. Each of these windows is 25 feet high and 5 feet wide. Next slide. This is a detail of the lower portion of the Elijah window. And the prophet is reaching his arm down. You can see his head towards the top and an arm reaching down through the center. And it's almost as if he is coming from heaven. His hand reaches the 12 squares in the bottom frame, and they represent the 12 stones that Elijah used to build the altar during his duel with the prophets of Baal who served Queen Jezebel. If you look real closely, or if you just look long enough towards the bottom of this window, you'll see some agonized faces. They represent the Hebrew prophets that were slain by the wicked queen. And then at the very bottom of the window, you can see their blood flowing down into the earth. So the beauty of the window's colors and the complexity of the design and the power of the illustrated stories have the potential to bring worshipers at Knesset Israel into prayerful contemplation of the struggle of the Jewish people to survive from Bible times to the present, and to remind them of the powerful words and actions of prophets who can guide them in their lives today. Next slide. Before retiring, I served St. John's Lutheran Church down the road from Knesset Israel. We also had stained glass windows, more traditional, but also relevant to the worship experience of the congregation. Facing the altar, congregants faced a crucifixion window. And in our faith tradition, that kind of window invites people to contemplate their sins and to contemplate God's gracious forgiveness. During most worship services, there is a ritual community confession and absolution or forgiveness that takes place during the worship service. So that window brings people into the part of the liturgy and contributes to their participation in confession and forgiveness. Next slide. As the congregation leaves worship, they face the resurrection window in the back of the sanctuary. And it reminds them that through the forgiveness and teaching they participated in during worship, they too have been given a new life in union with Christ. As they leave, the window invites them to go into the world filled with new life and a fresh start, called to be allies of the risen Christ. The windows at St. John's mediate the meaning of the liturgy and prompt worshipers to respond appropriately. Next slide. So both an abundance of sacred images and stark simplicity can elicit a response recognizing the transcendence and immanence of the divine. The abundance of images in the Hindu temple shown here overwhelms the devotee with a sense of the transcendence of the divine, a sense that the divine is beyond comprehension. Like, how can your mind even wrap itself around the images that you're seeing all at once in this temple? On the right, the simplicity of a Wan Buddhist meditation space quiets the mind and body and opens the viewer to interior spiritual riches. Both kinds of art engender awe. Next slide. In Islam, Allah's complexity being beyond human comprehension is alluded to in the complex geometric and floral designs in Islamic art. Here, combined with calligraphic inscriptions around the border of this niche. So this is a mihrab, a niche in the wall of a masjid or a religious school that indicates the direction of Mecca, the direction, of course, which Muslims face when praying. So it's the architectural and symbolic focus of religious buildings in Islam. The function of Muslim prayer is to bring the one praying into conformity with the will of Allah. So the design of the mihrab points to the transcendence of Allah, placing the worshiper in a position of humility, and then the calligraphy's content, what's written there, reinforces this message and mediates to the worshiper the requirements for faithful living. Next slide. Some prayer rugs, such as this one, have the image of a lamp placed where the forehead of the one praying is placed during prostration. So this image mediates the reality that Allah is the light, and Allah's light is to be welcomed into the mind of the one praying. Next slide. Especially in the teaching of Hasidic Jews, the entire material world, and even more so the letters of Torah and of prayer, pulsate with divine energy and godly luminosity. The Hasids have what Christians might call a sacramental view of the universe, or philosophers might call panentheism. And by the way, I'm not sure how the smiley face got on that on that image to the right, but that was there when I downloaded it. Anyway, as Hasidic Jews envision the sacred within each letter of the prayer that they are reading, they feel able to unite with holiness and participate in bringing unity to the fractured reality that they experience. So for the Hasidic tradition and many other traditions, ecstasy is within reach. This explains why the Torah scroll is being held so closely. By hugging it, one unites with the holiness within. For Hasidic Jews, the material world and the letters of the Torah mediate unity with the sacred. Next slide. The word talit literally means a little tent or a closet in which one can close oneself off from the world in order to pray and spend time with God. I'm going to read for you a paragraph from Yael Schumann from the Reconstructionist tradition of Judaism. Back in 1994, she wrote, "The Jewish tradition is rich in ritual objects that can actually change our state of mind, reach past all the objections and barricades we have to spirituality, and help us connect to the sense of meaning present all around us in the world. Wrapping myself in a talit changed my experience of praying in community. Previously, I felt watched. I felt too self-conscious to be spiritually open. By creating a private space within the community, I have been able to open my heart. Putting a talit over my head during the Amidah, during the silent prayer, allows me to speak to God, to feel safe enough to speak words of apology or to surrender and give up my psychological resistance. So this very object, a talit, had the power to create safe space for me. I could feel held, secure. And from there, I could let go and feel the support of the sustaining power of life and of the community." That's from Yael Schumann. Next slide. Eastern Orthodox Christians understand icons, as we said before, to be mediators during prayer. For people of this tradition, icons are windows through which they may see heaven and through which the light of heaven shines on them. The figures in this icon refer to the angels who visited Abraham and announced to him that he and Sarah would have a child and generations would be born to populate a great nation. The three figures simultaneously represent the Trinity, Christianity's understanding of God as three in one, a united community that would gather around a table. You see their hands pointing to one another, the wings of the angelic figures leaning towards each other. So there is a circle that's formed and then echoed in the chalice that's on the altar. Henry Nouwen, a Roman Catholic, wrote a book on praying with icons, and regarding this particular icon, he wrote, "As we place ourselves in front of the icon in prayer, we come to experience a gentle invitation to participate in the intimate conversation that is taking place among the three divine angels, and to join them around the table." So the icon mediates so that those praying with icons become united with the realities that are depicted in the image. Next slide. Roman Catholic teaching about art and prayer goes back to the early centuries of Christianity. In the 600s, Pope St. Gregory the Great insisted that the faithful be led, and I quote, from vision to adoration. A century later, St. John de Damascene wrote that, quote, the beauty and color of images are stimuli to prayer, just as the spectacle of the countryside spurs my heart to glorify God. This painting by Ribera shows the intimacy of Jesus with Mary, Joseph, St. Anne, who's the dark figure behind, and the mother of Jesus, and also Catherine of Alexandria, who is the figure kneeling. It was her vision of the Virgin and Child in the late 200s that led to her conversion and eventual martyrdom for her public witness. This intimacy is what leads Catholics to pray to the saints, saints who are in heaven with Jesus, and so close they can pass along the prayers of the faithful. Images of the saints also mediate God's messages to the ones praying. For example, if one is a parent, as one is praying to Mary or Joseph, the message is to be loving parents, as Mary and Joseph were. But to all of us, whether we're parents or not, meditating on such a painting as this would bring us the message that we should all strive to be as responsive to God's will as Mary and Joseph were. That's in the Roman Catholic tradition. Go ahead. Since the word Buddha means enlightened one, there are many Buddhas. The Amida Buddha has been popular in Japan and throughout East Asia. He is also known as the Buddha of immeasurable light and the Buddha of limitless life. While many branches of Buddhism have a more abstract understanding of enlightenment and do not posit individual consciousness in that state, Amida is believed to preside over a heavenly paradise and promises salvation and rebirth in his paradise for all worshipers. So meditation encourages practitioners to visualize Amida in his heavenly paradise and accumulate religious merit through simple meditation and the recitation of prayers or sutras. So this meditation on this image gives the Buddhist the merit to eventually be brought into the heavenly paradise of Amida. In all branches of Buddhism, it is common to see images in which Buddha is seated upon a throne of lotus blossoms. As you probably know, the lotus plant is rooted in the muck at the bottom of a pond, but it blossoms above the water. And so it's a great symbol that stands for enlightenment or paradise that is detached from the muck of the world. So this sculpture, which has the lotus blossom as the throne, this sculpture mediates the attitude and content desired in Buddhist meditation. Now back to the Hindu image of Shiva. Large and conspicuous eyes are often featured in Hindu images. During prayer, the gaze of the image meets that of the worshiper. And that exchange of vision, that meeting of the eyes, is called darshan, and it lies at the heart of Hindu worship. Diana Eck wrote a book on darshan, and she defines it this way. She says it is seeing, especially the visual perception of the sacred. The image is not just a device for the focusing of human vision, but is charged with the presence of the God. The image is one of the many ways in which the Lord becomes accessible to men and women, evoking their affections. Now, in addition to the image functioning as a mediator, connecting the worshiper with a god such as Shiva, the god inhabiting the image also is a mediator. In the Hindu traditions, each god in Hinduism connects the worshiper to Brahman, which is the one divine essence above all gods. So there are at least some scholars, I would suggest many, though I haven't done extensive research, but some scholars suggest that Hinduism is really monotheistic, rather than polytheistic, worshiping one God, Brahman, who is connected because of the mediation of all of the lesser gods. So just a bit of food for thought, monotheistic rather than polytheistic. That may be a bridge that allows people from monotheistic traditions to have greater understanding. Finally, in this section, 2 paintings in the next slide. These would probably not be viewed as religious paintings by most people, but the one on the left is by Frederick Edwin Church from the 1800s. And he was quoted as saying that his landscapes were meant to convey the glory of God, the Creator. That was his purpose in painting, the hoped for effect that it would have on the viewer. And one feature of his landscapes, it may be even hard to see on your screen, but there's a kind of a bridge over a chasm towards the bottom center of this painting. And on that bridge, there is a tiny human figure riding a donkey. Yeah, there. That's a theological statement about how humanity ought to understand itself fitting in to the created world. A similar message is expressed in the painting on the right from Korea. Landscape painting is highly valued in Korea due to the dominance of Confucianism. An article published by the Asia Society tells us, quote, "This philosophy prescribed, among other things, the cultivation of the intellect and humility. Translated into art, it meant that pictures of the human figure, the physical body, the mundane activities of humans, even historical episodes that focus on human achievement, all these were secondary. Instead, landscape painting emerged as the means for exploration and expression of the intellect and of the larger world beyond human beings. The Asian attitude of respect and even awe towards the power of nature imbues these kinds of paintings with spirituality. They mediate a prayerful connection between viewers and sacred nature." So now let's go back to the gallery view and see if any questions have arisen or any thoughts or comments have come to you that you'd like to, maybe examples of how art mediates the sacred in your practice or in practices you're familiar with that I didn't cover.
I was thinking about indigenous art, especially the beading and the beautiful silversmith work and use of stones and so forth that are so not only immediately identifiable as being from that tradition, but and people's costumes too. And I think that's all part of the same enticement into holy space, to understanding that all our senses are being engaged, at once.
Yes, thank you. I think indigenous peoples, wherever we might find them or learn of them, would also fit very well into this kind of presentation. Thank you.
I can actually put you in touch with an indigenous artist, so we could do that later. And she has a lot of pieces of weavings and so forth that she could send you photographs and so forth. And
yeah, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, that's giving me the idea of looking at one of our beautiful shawls that has, and making sure every religion has a representation in your presentation. I mean, Wiccan, and there's going to be a new religion. Well, I suppose it's science with the quantum physics and all that. But this has been a most impressive and transformational presentation. As I listened and was with what you were presenting, the way that it occurred was you could actually enter into that space and feel what was being created and longed for and reached. And thank you for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you. Although I will say the experience is even more impactful if you're in person with the pieces of art. But Zoom is certainly a decent substitute when that's not possible, either to bring people together over the miles, or there have been people who have been participating in programs that I've given over Zoom, people who are not able to get out for one reason or another, physical disability or geographical distance from Philadelphia and so on. So I've been very grateful for Zoom and its potential. Well, why don't we just go on into the next slide, the last part, which is really quite brief. And this third portion is titled Art That Models Prayer. So it's art that shows people in the act of prayer in different traditions. And so let's start with seeing a depiction of the historical Buddha. And it's an image of the historical Buddha in prayer under the Bodhi tree. And the mudra, or hand gesture, of his left hand denotes meditation. It is in his lap. The palm is upright. It symbolizes calm, detachment, and focused attention. His right hand is pointing toward the earth, and it recalls a moment when Siddhartha, the historical Buddha before enlightenment, when Siddhartha experienced opposition in his quest toward enlightenment. So just when he was about to enter enlightenment, the demon Mara attacked him with armies of monsters, trying to chase him from his place under the Bodhi tree. The about-to-be Buddha did not move. So Mara went on the offensive and claimed the seat of enlightenment for himself, saying that his spiritual accomplishments were greater than Siddhartha's. Mara's monstrous soldiers cried out together, "We are his witnesses." And then Mara sneered at Siddhartha, "Who will speak for you?" Siddhartha reached out his right hand and touched the earth. This is the gesture in the painting. And the earth itself roared, "I bear you witness." Well, Mara and his army were no match for that, and they vanished into the thin air. As the morning star rose in the sky, Siddhartha Gautama realized enlightenment and became a Buddha, one who is awake. One who is awake is at peace, having overcome all threats. So this painting models the qualities of peace and persistence necessary in prayer, and illustrates that hand gestures are important in Buddhist prayer, and it should be noted also in Hindu prayer. Next slide. This image is of a follower of the Jain religion. Actually, it is thought to be one of the 24 jinas, or savior saints, and even thought by many to be Jainism's founder, Mahavira, who lived in India at the same time as the historical Buddha, between 600 and 500 BCE. So this sculpture models the intense asceticism monastics in the Jain tradition aspire to. The Jina is portrayed without clothing and slender around the waist, a sign that he has given up connection with all worldly things, even his clothes, and that he has been fasting for a long period of time. Some Jain devotees even have taken up the religious practice of salakana, which is voluntary fasting unto death. It is certainly a radical way to disengage from the material world and to become one with the spiritual world beyond. Not all Jains, in fact, very few, go to these extremes, but all Jains admire their spiritual forebears who did go to these extremes. They often pray in the posture and with the hands positioned, as we see in this sculpture, remembering those forebears of the faith. Next slide. This is an example of darshan, which we discussed earlier in the Hindu traditions, seeing the sacred within an image. In the painting, we see the eyes of the woman meeting the eyes of two of the four faces of Brahma. And at this moment, she is connected via Brahma to Brahman, the God beyond all gods. An example of someone at prayer in the Hindu tradition. Next slide. So the prayers which devout Muslims pray 5 times a day each require physical movement for those who are able, standing, bowing, kneeling, placing one's forehead on the prayer mat, standing again, and repeating these movements at prescribed times during the prayer. You really have to be in shape to do this properly. I'll tell you a story. Once when I was invited to participate in Muslim prayer, I severely sprained my big toe getting up from the kneeling position. I was limping for several days, and I took lots of teasing for having sustained an interfaith injury. So we have to be careful when we're out there. We have to be careful. But this illustration shows a prince who is praying. His bowing is a part of the prescribed movements. He is praying on a prayer rug adorned simply with the shape of the mihrab pointing towards Mecca. And the simplicity of the prayer rug in this painting contrasts with the complex designs we saw in the slides of a mihrab and prayer rug earlier, and we can see those again in the next slide. So the complexity has that theological teaching significance when it's complex designs. The simplicity of the painting that I just showed is a call to the humility that comes from perceiving the complexity and the awesomeness of Allah. Next slide, please. This is Roger van der Weiden's crucifixion scene at the Philadelphia Museum. And Mary is the model of one praying that I've chosen to show. And I chose her in this work of art because she is offering 2 kinds of prayer at once. With her folded hands, she is praying to Jesus, praising his divinity. And by swooning with grief, she is placing before God her human emotions at seeing the suffering of her son. This moment in Mary's prayer life is recognized in Catholicism during the Mass of the 7 Sorrows of Mary, celebrated coming up soon on September 15th. An ancient hymn is often sung that day. It is titled the Stabat Mater Dolorosa, which is translated as the sorrowful mother was standing. The slide contains a few verses in which the ones praying pray that they may conform to Mary's model, and I'd like to read those for you. At her cross, her station keeping, stood the mournful mother, weeping, close to her son to the last. Through her heart his sorrow sharing, all his bitter anguish bearing, now at length the sword has passed. O thou mother, fount of love, touch my spirit from above, make my heart with thine accord. Make me feel as thou hast felt. Make my soul to glow and melt with the love of Christ my Lord. Holy Mother, pierce me through, in my heart each wound renew, of my Savior crucified. Let me share with thee his pain, who for all my sins was slain, who for me in torments died. Let me mingle tears with thee, mourning him who mourned for me all the days that I may live. By the cross with thee to stay, there with thee to weep and pray, is all I ask of thee to give. Amen. Now there are over 20 verses to the Stabat Mater, and it has been set to music by several composers, and it's glorious when it is sung. The model for the Praying Jew, which is by the most famous Jewish artist of the 20th century, Marc Chagall. The model was an old beggar whom the artist invited to sit for the painting, but he clothed him in the prayer clothes of his father, Chagall's father. These prayer clothes consist of a talit, the fringed shawl with the black bands, and also phylacteries, 2 small square leather boxes containing passages from the scriptures, which were bound with leather straps to the head and left arm of Jewish men during prayer. Chagall captures the rapt attention of his model, who is focused on prayer. Focused attention is desired by all praying Jews, whether or not they are wearing phylacteries and a talit. And then the final slide. This is a print that I purchased in Safed, a city in Israel that is important in the history of Jewish mysticism, and now also is famous as a home to many artists and craftspeople. The artist of this work is named Cherokee. It shows a mother and a daughter at the Western Wall, sometimes called the Wailing Wall, a sacred place for prayer in Jerusalem. It is part of the site where Solomon's temple is thought to have stood. In the artwork, calligraphy surrounds the woman and fills in the shape of her clothing. There is also calligraphy around the edges of the print and in the woman's notebook. This is a common feature of sacred Jewish art, to use calligraphy and often to have sacred texts included in beautiful calligraphy. At the same time, the passage is illustrated with more representative art. At the Western Wall, many write their prayers on paper and place them in the cracks of the wall. So I was there on an interfaith trip, and people of several traditions found it a meaningful place to pray together. And most of us left our written prayers in the cracks as we rested our foreheads on the cool stones. So that concludes my presentation. I'm wondering if any of these works of art relate to your own prayer life, and are there other depictions of people praying that instruct you in your prayers? Or any other closing comments you'd like to make? Ruth, you have your hand up first.
You know, John, I saw the paintings of Marc Chagall called The Resurrection, which depicts an interfaith theme that is inescapable. And you might want to add that to your collection. So in it, you see, for example, Jesus is on the cross, but the cloth that is around his loincloth is a talit, is a Jewish prayer shawl.
Yes.
And in the background of one of the paintings, it's a series of 3 paintings. In the background is a depiction of the survivors of the Holocaust, of the Jews who were killed in very direct relationship to Jesus' suffering too. So, you know, I think I must have stayed there for a few hours. I was really transfixed. And I was thinking that, you know, this is the kind of painting that could be discussed in an interfaith setting, because it's the Jewish sensibilities as you said, the most famous Jewish artists of the 20th century, but who had a direct connection to the Christian experience and the crucifixion and resurrection. It was just stunning. I don't know whether anybody else has seen those paintings, but I just want to recommend them to you. And I want to thank you again for such a meaningful session.
Well, thank you. I have used that one of those paintings, the White Crucifixion, it's called, and it has been a wonderful resource for discussion, whether Jesus can be perceived as a symbol of universal Jewish suffering, a part of that long history of Jewish suffering, that has a direct connection to the pogroms and the Holocaust and the whole history of the exile and of Jewish suffering, or whether just the place of Jesus within Judaism is an interesting topic for Jews and Christians to talk about together. So yes, that's a wonderful resource. And now that you remind me of it, my presentation would have been stronger if I had included it here. But maybe we would have just talked on till we had to stop at 3. But anyway, thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Yes, Swami.
Yes, one new thing that just came out in the world of nature. I'm sure many of you have seen the photos from the James Webb Telescope of space going back billions of years. And I've been impressed with all the colors that are shown. And I do watercolors. So I just started a series of what I call my James Webb paintings. And I'm excited to continue. But
that's great.
Yeah, it's just, they're so beautiful. And
is your painting process a spiritual experience for you?
Oh, yes, definitely. Oh, I've been painting since I was 5 years old, but yes, it's definitely a meditation. And I'm just every day on YouTube, I study the James Webb photos, and it's been quite inspiring.
Sounds like a wonderful spiritual practice.
Yes. And the other thing I wanted to mention, Sharon, I love, Ruth, Sharon. We've met at many interfaith conferences, but I certainly love your Interfaith, the musical. And I'm so happy that you're continuing with that. And I wanted to also let you know that on Saturday, I'll be doing a program that will include an interfaith service with ritual music from different faiths, and invite you to that at 8 o'clock on Saturday. The program is called Yoga and Faith, and it does include an interfaith service, which I find it connects prayer and music.
Thank you.
John, I also see that Rob wrote in the chat, how does this program compare to your tours at the Philadelphia Art Museum?
It's a little more comprehensive than tours at the Art Museum, because I didn't have to walk from place to place. It also is more expansive because I could go outside the Philadelphia Museum's collection, although probably half of the slides that I showed were from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but I could draw on other works of art. I would mention that probably I don't know whether it's my favorite, but a popular form of event that I give at the museum follows a little different format that I'll mention now. And that is that we come together as a group, and I choose 1 or 2 pieces of art and to provide a guided meditation of each of those pieces of art that includes group conversation about the impact that the art is making, and both as a piece of art and as a spiritual experience. And then I turn everybody loose to go out into the museum and try to find a piece of art that speaks to them, that speaks to their soul and nourishes their faithfulness. And then we come back together again and we take a little tour of the pieces that the people chose for themselves, and each person talks about what they experienced, and then other people chime in with what they see in the piece that the person chose, and it becomes a wonderful conversation and a wonderful community building kind of experience. So today was more typical of, or was more like the programs that I do, which are, I guess, trying to promote understanding and empathy with other traditions. And then the one that I just described, that kind of program invites people from various traditions to bring their own spiritual quest into the museum. And I must also give credit to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They like people having a different kind of experience there. They like bringing audiences into the museum that might not come in before. They pay for the admission for everybody who participates in my programs, and they pay for their parking.
Wow.
And their Office of Community Engagement has been just wonderful to work with. We've been doing this together for 7 years or so. It's been great.
It's amazing how much you are affecting the entire city, all the people who come in and are part of your program. And that, I think
It's
that's one of the things we were hoping to do for this week, was as we unite interfaith groups and people doing interfaith work, they learn they're not alone in appreciating and being part of the kind of stuff that you have been presenting, which is incredible. Thank you, John.
Well, I thank everyone for having the endurance to go as long as we did. And also, I see Rob is asking when my next tour will be at the PMA in, I think the second week in September will be the next one. Although I do give tours for the museum a couple times a month as well. So, but Rob, you'll get the newsletter, I'm sure. So I think we should give people time to take a break if they want to get on the 3 o'clock presentation. And again, just my gratitude for your comments, for your suggestions, for your interest, and for helping me realize in a fresh way that that what we all are doing is important work, and that there are people out there who are kindred spirits. It's just is so helpful to have that affirmed today. So thank you so much. It's been great for me.
John, would you put your email in the chat, please?
Okay, Kate or Kat, can you do that? It's JBH, as you know, JBH at Interfaith.
What would we do without our technical gurus?
Well, I'd be lost. That looks right. JBH at interfaithphiladelphia.com.